Namaste, Dandavat Pranam.
Namaste. Dhanyavad.
And this is Krishna Keshav Das, and I'm here with Srimati Kanupriya Devi Dasi, and we are here reading Hegel's Aesthetics, continuing in the introduction. Irony. From this tendency, and especially from the convictions and doctrines of F. von Schlegel, there was further developed in diverse shapes the so-called irony. See Philosophy of Right, text 140, English translation from Oxford, 1942. This had its deeper root in one of its aspects in fixed philosophy, insofar as the principles of this philosophy were applied to art. F. von Schlegel, like Schelling, started from fixed standpoint. Schelling to go beyond it altogether, Schlegel to develop it in his own way, and to tear himself loose from it. Now, so far as concerns the closer connection of fixed propositions with one tendency of irony, we need, in this respect, emphasize only the following points about this irony. Namely, that first, Fichte sets up the ego as the absolute principle of all knowing, reason, and cognition, and at that, the ego that remains throughout abstract and formal. Secondly, this ego is therefore in itself just simple, and on the other hand, every particularity, every characteristic, every content is negated in it, since everything is submerged in this abstract freedom and unity, while on the other hand, every content which is to have value for the ego is only put and recognized by the ego itself. Whatever is only by the instrumentality of the ego. And what exists by instrumentality, I can equally well annihilate again. Now, if we stop at these absolutely empty forms, which originate from the absoluteness of the abstract ego, nothing is treated in and for itself, and as valuable in itself, but only as produced by the subjectivity of the ego. But in that case, the ego remains lord and master of everything, and in no sphere of morals, law, things, human and divine, profane and sacred, is there anything that would not first have to be laid down by the ego, and that therefore could not equally well be destroyed by it. Consequently, everything genuinely and independently real becomes only a show, not true, and genuine on its own account or through itself, but a mere appearance due to the ego, in whose power and caprice, and at whose free disposal it remains. To admit or cancel it depends wholly on the pleasure of the ego, already absolute in itself simply as ego. Now, thirdly, the ego is a living, active individual, and its life consists in making its individuality real in its own eyes and in those of others, in expressing itself and bringing itself into appearance. For every man, by living, tries to realize himself and does realize himself. Now, in relation to beauty and art, this acquires the meaning of living as an artist and forming one's life artistically. But on this principle, I live as an artist when all my action and my expression in general, in connection with any content, whatever, remains for me a mere show and assumes a shape which is wholly in my power. In that case, I am not really in earnest either with this content or generally with its expression and actualization. For genuine earnestness enters only by means of substantial interest, something of intrinsic worth like truth, ethical life, etc., by means of a content which counts as such for me as essential, so that I only become essential myself in my own eyes, insofar as I have immersed myself in such a content, and have brought myself into conformity with it in all my knowing and acting. When the ego that sets up and dissolves everything out of its own caprice is the artist, to whom no content of consciousness appears as absolute and independently real, but only as a self-made and destructible show, such earnestness can find no place, since validity is ascribed only to the formalism of the ego. True, in the eyes of others, the appearance which I present to them may be regarded seriously, and that they take me to be really concerned with the matter in hand. But in that case, they are simply deceived, poor limited creatures, without the faculty and ability to apprehend and reach the loftiness of my standpoint. Therefore, this shows me that not everyone is so free, i.e., formally free, meaning not even merely capricious enough, as to see in everything which otherwise has value, dignity, and sanctity for mankind, just a product of his own power of caprice, whereby he is at liberty to either grant validity to such things to determine himself and fill his life by means of them, or the reverse. Moreover, this virtuosity of an ironical artistic life apprehends itself as a divine creative genius for which anything and everything is only an unsubstantial creature, to which the creator, knowing himself to be disengaged and free from everything, is not bound, because he is just as able to destroy it as to create it. In that case, he who has reached this standpoint of divine genius looks down from his high rank on all other men, for they are pronounced dull and limited, inasmuch as law, morals, etc., still count for them as fixed, essential, and obligatory. So then the individual who lives in this way is an artist, does give himself relations to others. He lives with friends, mistresses, etc., but by his being a genius, this relation to his own specific reality, his particular actions, as well as to what is absolute and universal, is at the same time null. His attitude to it all is ironical. These 3 points comprise the general meaning. These 3 points comprise the general meaning of the divine irony of genius, as this concentration of the ego into itself, for which all bonds are snapped and which can live only in the bliss of self-enjoyment. This irony was invented by Friedrich von Schlegel, and many others have babbled about it or are now babbling about it. The next form of this negativity of irony, on the one hand, the vanity of everything factual, moral, and of intrinsic worth, the nullity of everything objective and absolutely valid. If the ego remains at this standpoint, everything appears to it as null and vain, except its own subjectivity, which therefore becomes hollow and empty, and itself mere vanity. Eitelkeit. Hegel is playing on its 2 meanings, vacuity and conceit. But on the other hand, the ego may, contrariwise, fail to find satisfaction in this self-enjoyment and instead become inadequate to itself, so that it now feels a craving for the solid and the substantial, for specific and essential interests. Out of this comes misfortune and the contradiction that on the one hand, the subject does want to penetrate into truth and longs for objectivity, but on the other hand, cannot renounce his isolation and withdrawal into himself, or tear himself free from this unsatisfied abstract inwardness. Now he is attacked by the yearning, which also we have seen proceeding from the Fichtean philosophy. The dissatisfaction of this quintessence and impotence, quintessence and impotence, which may not do or touch anything for fear of losing its inner harmony, and which, even if pure in itself, is still unreal and empty, despite its desire for reality and what is absolute, is the source of yearning in a morbid, beautiful soul. For a truly beautiful soul acts and is actual. That longing, however, is only the empty, vain subject's sense of nullity, and he lacks the strength to escape from this vanity and fill himself with a content of substance. But insofar as irony has been made into a form of art, it has not stopped at giving artistic form merely to the personal life and particular individuality of the ironical artist. Apart from the artistic work presented in his own actions, etc., the artist was supposed to produce external works of art, also as the product of his imagination. The principle of these productions, which can now emerge for the most part only in poetry, is now over again to represent the divine as the ironical. But the ironical, as the individuality of genius, lies in the self-destruction of the noble, great, and excellent. And so the objective art formations too will have to display only the principle of absolute subjectivity by showing forth what has worth and dignity for mankind as null in its self-destruction. This then implies that not only is there to be no seriousness about law, morals, and truth, but that there is nothing in what is lofty and best, since in its appearance in individuals, characters, and actions, it contradicts and destroys itself, and so is ironical about itself. This form, taken abstractly, borders nearly on the principle of the comic. Yet in this kinship, the cosmic must be essentially distinguished from the ironic. For the comic must be restricted to showing that what destroys itself is something inherently null, a false and contradictory phenomenon, a whim, e.g. an oddity, a particular caprice in comparison with a mighty passion, or even a supposedly tenable principle and firm maxim. But it is a totally different thing if what is in fact moral and true, any inherently substantial content, displays itself in an individual and by his agency as null. In such an event, the individual is null in character and contemptible, and his weakness and lack of character is brought into his portrayals also. Therefore, in this difference between the ironic and the comic, what is essentially at issue is the content of what is destroyed. There are bad, useless people who cannot stick to their fixed and important aim, but abandon it again and let it be destroyed in themselves. Irony loves this irony of loss and character. For true character implies, on the one hand, essentially worthy aims, and on the other hand, a firm grip of such aims, so that the whole being of its individuality would be lost if the aims had to be given up and abandoned. This fixity and substantiality constitutes the keynote of character. Cato can live only as a Roman and a Republican. But if irony is taken as the keynote of the representation, then the most inartistic of all principles is taken to be the principle of the work of art. For the result is to produce, in part, commonplace figures, in part, figures worthless and without bearing, since the substance of their being proves in them to be a nullity. In part, finally, there appear attached to them those yearnings and unresolved contradictions of the heart, which we mentioned above. Such representations can awaken no genuine interest. For this reason, after all, on the part of irony, there are steady complaints about the public's deficiency in profound sensibility, artistic insight, and genius, because it does not understand this loftiness of irony, i.e., the public does not enjoy this mediocrity and what is partly wishy-washy, partly characterless. And it is a good thing that these worthless yearning natures do not please. It is a comfort that this insincerity and hypocrisy are not to people's liking. And that, on the contrary, people want full and genuine interests as well as characters which remain true to their important intrinsic worth. As a historical remark, it may be added that it was especially Solger and Ludwig Tieck. So Solger, see Philosophy of Right. Philosophy of Right is another book by Hegel. So it talks about these people there. And see below section on the ancient epigram. Hegel dealt at some length with Solger and Tieck in a review of Solger's posthumous writings in 1820. So as an historical remark, it may be added that it was especially Solger and Ludwig Tieck who adopted irony as the supreme principle of art. Of Solger, this is not the place to speak at the length he deserves, and I must confine myself to a few observations. Solger was not content, like the others, with superficial philosophical culture. On the contrary, his genuinely speculative inmost need impelled him to plumb the depths of the philosophical idea. In this process, he came to the dialectical moment of the idea, to the point which I call infinite absolute negativity. Through the activity of the idea, in so negating itself as infinite and universal as to become finitude and particularity, and in nevertheless canceling this negation in turn, and so reestablishing the universal and infinite in the finite and particular. To this negativity, Solger firmly clung, and of course, it is one element in the speculative idea, yet interpreted as this purely dialectical unrest and dissolution of both infinite and finite, only one element, and not, as Solger will have it, the whole idea. Unfortunately, Solger's life was broken off too soon for him to have been able to reach the concrete development of the philosophical idea. So he got no further than this aspect of negativity, which has an affinity with the ironic dissolution of the determinate and the inherently substantial alike, and in which he also saw the principle of artistic activity. Yet in his actual life, having regard to the firmness, seriousness, and stoutness of his character, he was neither himself an ironic artist of the kind depicted above, nor was his profound sense for genuine works of art nurtured by his persistent study of art, in this respect of an ironical nature. So much in justification of Soger, who in his life, philosophy, and art deserves to be distinguished from the previously mentioned apostles of irony. As regard to Ludwig Tieck, his culture too dates from that period in which Jena was for some time the cultural center. Tieck and others of these distinguished people are indeed very familiar with such expressions as irony, but without telling us what they mean. So Tieck does always demand irony, yet when he goes on himself to judge works of art, while it is true that his recognition and description of their greatness is excellent, if we hope to find here the best opportunity of showing what the irony is in such a work as, e.g., Romeo and Juliet, we are deceived. We hear no more about irony. The term romantic irony seems to be derived from F. von Schlegel, and it is generally understood to mean that the writer, while still creative and emotional, should remain aloof and self-critical. What Hegel says of Tieck is correct, and in Tieck's critical essays, especially on Shakespeare, he seldom, if ever, has anything to say about irony. Hegel may have in mind the preface to volume 6 of Tieck's collected works. It appeared in 1828 and mentions Solger. I owe this note to Professor James Traynor. For a full treatment of romantic irony and Hegel's attitude to it, see O. Pergler, Hegel's Kritik der Romantik, from published in Bonn, Germany, 1956. Before we go on, Didi, did you have anything to say or anything? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, there was lots going through my mind as you were reading, trying to remember. Things that stood out, I suppose, were when he was talking about the ego, sort of like almost like a, self-indulgent, almost like saying that to go further to get to the truth, one has to be almost exhausted by one's own self-indulgence to get to the truth. But then when you further read on, it was almost like saying then but to be able to let go of, I suppose then I was interpreting as like attachments to self. In able to really get to that truth, you need to be able to detach from your ego, from yourself, and I think that's the hard thing, where it's to be able to fully detach and connect with truth. And I think irony is an interesting subject as well within art, because I think quite often, the artist might have an idea about what he's trying to do, and it can end up being completely different, completely opposite. So, I mean, in terms of relating that to also our Krishna consciousness endeavors and journey, I suppose we can start off with an idea. So this idea of, man proposes and God disposes. We might have an idea about something, but in actual fact, something might be completely different. The outcome might be totally different. Those were the things that were sort of coming to me when you were talking and reading. You might got something totally different that'd be interesting to.
I agree with your conclusion. It was interesting to see his development. For me, I was trying to pay attention to how he started with that self-enjoyment of wanting to enjoy beauty for oneself, and then by taking that self-centered approach, and identifying as an artist, and kind of cutting yourself off from that whole, which is where you experienced beauty and the inspiration to then enjoy it. Then you cut yourself off from that. And now sitting there with this self-centered desire to enjoy beauty, you try to engage in art and you create art. And because this kind of individual or this kind of artist may have some like raw talent, but they're so absorbed in themselves that they become intoxicated by their own expression of this beauty that is coming from them, and that it relates to how their isolated view is, and it's actually coming out like that. So they become intoxicated with that. And so they're kind of like in this, the artistic genius who is, doing things and saying things that only they can understand. No one else knows what they're talking about, but somehow still they accept that they're just an artistic genius. But then, but then the actual output of their work, is affected by that internal process of cutting themselves off from the whole and just expressing themselves in the way that makes them self feel best. So that affects the way that the artwork comes out. And then so people actually don't end up, they can't
Yeah,
relate to it. So
yeah,
they don't enjoy it themselves. They don't receive any benefit from it. And then that causes some frustration or some kind of displeasure with that individual who's intoxicated with their own sense of self, because of course in the beginning of their idea of becoming an artist, it was to some extent to receive some public adornment for their works of art. And now so like there's this gap, like what happened, I'm an artistic genius and I feel great about what I'm doing and I think it's, I'm amazing, but nobody else likes it. So it's like what happened? And then I think, hey, I think this is what he was saying, where either then they have to overcome that and continue to seek that higher ideal and reject that, or they can't overcome that and they just essentially like they're wrapped up in that until they die. And
but I thought it was interesting the point where it becomes a bit like null and void in a sense, because it's almost, it's not connecting with others in a sense. It's solely for the self. It's solely for that artist within
yeah,
himself, within their self. So then it almost becomes pointless. In
right.
one aspect, you could say it becomes pointless unless it's pushing that artist to a higher truth. If they get to that higher truth,
Yeah,
then it sucks. Then I guess you could say, yeah, it has some element of benefit and purpose. But then otherwise, if art is meant to be a shared thing, art is a visual, it's a shared thing. Maybe you see that as a connecting others, and it's a vehicle of expression and connection. Then if the message is not understood and appreciated, then yeah, it becomes, then you could say, well, what's its worth?
yeah.
So it's interesting.
And I think what he was saying is that that whole development is what this philosopher named Schlegel was presented. Like, I think that's what you said, right? Oh, not Schlegel. Yeah, Schlegel. Started fixed standpoint, shall and go beyond his own way. in terms of pollution. No, so far as concerns close connection. Okay, division of the subject. Oh, should we continue?
Yes, probably.
Okay, division of the subject. After the foregoing introductory remarks, it is now time to pass on to the study of our subject itself. But the introduction where we still are can in this respect do no more than sketch for our apprehension a conspectus of the entire course of our subsequent scientific studies. But since we have spoken of art as itself proceeding from the absolute idea, and have even pronounced its end to be the sensuous presentation of the absolute itself, we must proceed even in this conspectus by showing, at least in general, how the particular parts of the subject emerge from the conception of artistic beauty as the presentation of the absolute. Therefore, we must attempt in the most general way to awaken an idea of this conception. It has already been said that the content of art is the idea, while its form is the configuration of sensuous material. Now, art has to harmonize these two sides and bring them into free reconciled totality. The first point here is the demand that the content which is to come into artistic representation should be in itself qualified for such representation. For otherwise we obtain only a bad combination, because in that case, a content ill-adapted to figurativeness and external presentation is made to adopt this form, or in other words, material, explicitly prosaic, is expected to find a reality appropriate mode of presentation in the form antagonistic to its nature. And the second demand derived from the first requires of the content of art that it be not anything abstract in itself, but concrete, though not concrete in the sense in which the sensuous is concrete, when it is contrasted with everything spiritual and intellectual, and these are taken to be simple and abstract. For everything genuine in spirit and nature alike is inherently concrete, and despite its universality, has nevertheless subjectivity and particularity in itself. If we say, for example, of God, that he is simply one, the supreme being as such, we have thereby only enunciated a dead abstraction of the sub-rational understanding. Such a God, not apprehended himself in his concrete truth, will provide no content for art, especially not for visual art. Therefore, the Jews and the Turks have not been able, by art, to represent their God, who does not even amount to such an abstraction of the understanding, in the positive way that the Christians have. For in Christianity, God is set forth in his truth, and therefore as thoroughly concrete in himself as person, as subject, and more closely defined as spirit. What he is as spirit is made explicit for religious apprehension as a trinity of persons, which yet at the same time is the self-aware as one. As a trinity of persons, which at the same time is self-aware as one. Here we have essentiality or universality and particularization together with their reconciled unity. And only such a unity is the concrete. Now, since yeah.
Sorry, can I just go back to that last little bit when he's talking about? I'm just curious as to know, when it's talking about apprehension as a trinity of persons, which yet at the same time is self-aware as one. Could we say that is similar to like Achinta Bheda Bheda or not? Same but different, or not?
Yeah. I mean, he's talking about the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. So it's almost like he's saying they're different, but at the same time they're the same. They're one.
Mm-hmm.
Could you say that there?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Christians, you know, Christians say that, you know, Jesus, although obviously in the Bible Jesus is the Son of God and God is the Father. Right? It says that the distinction is there, the Father and the Son. Jesus says you can only come to the Father through me, through the Son. But at the same time, Christians accept God. Jesus is God.
Yeah.
So,
Same.
yeah.
Same.
Although like individuals like Hegel can recognize that, and maybe from the perspective of Krishna consciousness, where a Chincha Beta Beta philosophy is articulated, we can recognize that distinction, which is simultaneously one and different, or is some contradictory in some way, that is not very well articulated, I think, by many Christians. Although maybe that there may, as Hegel obviously is identifying kind of as a Christian here, so it's there, but I don't think many Christians see it like that.
No. The
But it's there.
interpretation of it. Yeah. It's there. It's interesting.
Now, since a content, in order to be true at all, must be of this concrete kind, art too demands similar concreteness, because the purely abstract universal has not in itself the determinate character of advancing to particularization in phenomenal manifestation and to unity with itself in these. Now, thirdly, if a sensuous form and shape is to correspond with a genuine and therefore concrete content, it must likewise be something individual, in itself, completely concrete and single. The fact that the concrete accrues to both sides of art, i.e., to both content and its presentation, is precisely the point in which both content and its presentation is precisely the point in which both can coincide and correspond with one another. Just as, for instance, the natural shape of the human body is such a sensuously concrete thing capable of displaying spirit, which is the concrete in itself, and of showing itself in conformity with it. Therefore, after all, we must put out of our minds the idea that it is purely a matter of chance that to serve as such a genuine shape and actual phenomena of the external world is selected. For art does not seize upon this form either because it just finds it there or because there is no other. On the contrary, the concrete content itself involves the factor of external, actual, and indeed even sensuous manifestation. But then, in return, this sensuous concrete thing, which bears the stamp of an essentially spiritual content, is also essentially for our inner apprehension, the external shape whereby the content is made visible and imaginable, has the purpose of existing solely for our mind and spirit. For this reason alone, are content and artistic form fashioned in conformity with one another. The purely sensuously concrete external nature as such does not have this purpose for the sole reason of its origin. The variegated, richly colored plumage of birds shines even when unseen. Their song dies away unheard. The torch thistle, which blooms for only one night, withers in the wilds of the southern forests without having been admired. And these forests, jungles themselves of the most beautiful and luxuriant vegetation, with the most sweet-smelling and aromatic perfumes, rot and decay, equally unenjoyed. But the work of art is not so naively self-centered. It is essentially a question in address to the responsive breast, a call to the mind and the spirit. Although illustration by art is not in this respect a matter of chance, it is, on the other hand, not the highest way of apprehending the spiritually concrete. The higher way, in contrast to representation, by means of the sensuously concrete, is thinking, which in a relative sense is indeed abstract, but it must be concrete, not one-sided, if it is to be true and rational. How far a specific content has its appropriate form in sensuous artistic representation, or whether owing to its own nature, it essentially demands a higher, more spiritual form, is a question of the distinction which appears at once. For example, in comparison between the Greek gods and God as conceived by Christian ideas. The Greek God is not abstract, but individual, closely related to the natural human form. The Christian God, too, is indeed a concrete personality, but is pure spirituality, and is to be known as spirit and in spirit. His medium of existence is therefore essentially inner knowledge, and not the external natural form through which he can be represented only imperfectly, and not in the whole profundity of his nature. But since art has the task of presenting the idea to immediate perception in a sensuous shape, and not in the form of thinking and pure spirituality as such, and since this presenting has its value and dignity in the correspondence and unity of both sides, i.e., the idea and its outward shape, it follows that the loftiness and excellence of art in attaining a reality adequate to its concept will depend upon the degree of inwardness and unity in which idea and shape appear fused into one. Okay. I think this is a good place to stop, Didi.
Yes, problem, no problem. Thank you. Dhanyavad.
Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Shripad Bhakti Madhava Puri Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Srila Isi Bhakti Vedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Srila Bhakti Rakshak Shuddhadev Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Srila Bhakti Sundar Govinda Dev Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Srila Bhakti Nirmal Acharya Dev Goswami Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Srila Bhakti Niskam Shanta Maharaj Ki Jai. Jai Rupa Nuga Guru Varga Ki Jai. All glories to the assembled devotees, all glories to the worldwide devotees, Sama Bhakti Veda Vrinda Ki Jai. Jai Navadvip Dham Ki Jai, Nishringapuri Dham Ki Jai, Mayapur Dham Ki Jai, Jagannath Puri Dham Ki Jai, Baladev Subhadra Jagannath Ju Ki Jai, Ganga Mai Yamuna Mai Ki Jai, Vrindavan Dham Ki Jai, Giri Govardhan Gupta Govardhan Dham Ki Jai, Sham Kund Radha Kund Ki Jai, Tulsi Devi, Bhakti Devi, Vrinda Devi Ki Jai. Jai Harinam Sankirtan Yagya Ki Jai, Scientific Sankirtan Yagya Ki Jai, Jai Princeton Bhakti Vedanta Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Institute Ki Jai, Sri Chaitanya Saraswat Mat Ki Jai, Nitai Gaura Pramanandi Hari 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 Bol, Jai Shrimati Kanapur Devi Dasi Ki Jai,
Krishna
Hari
Keshav Das
Bol,
Ki Jai.
Jai Gurudev. Dhanyavad Pranam Devi.
Dhanyavad.